All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for um, watching this recording. My name is Rosheka Faulkner. I'm with Chloe Sedith, and both of us co-led a faculty learning community, and we'll be talking about that today and some of the things that we learned and are applying in our classroom. So the title of this presentation is Liberatory Classroom: Lessons from Student-Engaged Bias-Free Grading. Okay. All right. So just briefly, a little bit more about myself. I'm in the School of Criminal Justice. I am a PhD student there, and I teach criminology, race, crime, and justice, and research methods. And both some of these have been in a online forum, and others are in person. And I'm really interested in the ways that bias can seep into the grading practices, and sort of thinking more critically about the ways that we can address those issues.
Awesome. And hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Sedith. I am also a PhD candidate in the School of Criminal Justice. I teach constitutional issues in criminal justice, as well as criminology and research methods. I came from a community education, advocacy, and organizing background prior to graduate school. So, a lot of my pedagogical approach in the classroom is informed by these grassroots experiences. And I became really interested in Bell Hooks's engaged pedagogy as an approach that really spoke to those experiences.
So briefly, just an overview of what we'll talk about. We'll talk about what an FLC is. We'll share a bit about engaged pedagogy and bias-free grading. We'll look at the work of the FLC that we've done, and we want to focus on three main things here. One being how we apply some of the key principles of engaged pedagogy and bias-free grading in our classroom. What are some of the benefits and challenges of these applications? And how do we translate these FLC insights into actionable teaching strategies?
Okay, so just by way of a little bit of background for folks who may not be familiar, we're going to do a brief overview of faculty learning communities, or what we will refer to as FLCs at Rutgers. So, faculty learning communities are really a fantastic resource put on by the P3 Collaboratory here at Rutgers. And FLCs are peer-led groups of usually around 8 to 10 faculty, staff, and graduate students who meet monthly to explore a topic or project connected to either pedagogical innovation, faculty development, or publicly engaged scholarship. So they're really designed to stimulate collaboration and foster experiential learning environments, encourage professional development with a peer support model for learning and action, and bridge disciplinary boundaries in an effort to support community building. So you can read more about FLCs on the P3's website, but we kind of just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview to know what we're talking about. So why an FLC, right? So again, Rashika and I both shared that we're both very passionate about teaching, and we've spent the last 2 years as colleagues, fellow PhD students, and friends trying to discuss pedagogy, and we were really seeking an approach to dig deeper in a meaningful and structured way. So again, I was really interested in engaged pedagogy, particularly given the challenges sort of revelations and transformations that were brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the really rapid evolution of AI technology, and particularly generative AI, into the mainstream and particularly into higher education. Building on Hooks's work along with Paulo Freire, Namalinda Florence, Bettina Love, and Mariam Kaba, and others, I was really craving kind of an innovative approach to course design. I wanted to sort of facilitate engagement and community building and design for equity and accessibility in the classroom space. Rashika?
Um, I keep forgetting to do this, but
Good.
just briefly on my interest in bias-free grading. I became interested in bias-free and the ways that bias could impact grading in the classroom as an undergrad and into being a master's student. And during that time, I was the vice president of the Student Senate, and so I had a little bit of um, access, so to speak, in sort of speaking with faculty members, and I tried to push our faculty or the faculty senate in thinking about the research around bias-free grading and the ways that bias could seep into the classroom and impact grading, right? And I was a student, and of course I cared about my grades, and so of course I cared about the ways that bias could be impacting my grades. Unfortunately, COVID happened and everything sort of fell flat, and I'm not sure that anything really happened with that, and I also graduated. But my interest in bias-free remained, and when I learned about FLCs, I saw this as a really good opportunity for us to sort of do this work with faculty, right? As thinking about the ways that we could more critically address issues of bias in our classroom.
Yeah, so Rashika and I, sort of saw this as an opportunity to kind of bridge both of our interests, to create this really structured opportunity through these monthly meetings to be able to deeply explore these questions, and also to be in dialogue with other teachers across various disciplines. Again, we're both coming from the School of Criminal Justice, and so we were interested in being able to bridge to folks in other disciplines in these conversations. And then finally, we saw this as an opportunity to model and really practice the kind of classroom environment we were trying to create for our students. We made an effort to kind of create the container and build the FLC in line with these values as a form of praxis of these ideas. So just to give a little bit of context about engaged pedagogy and bell hooks's work by way of sort of a very brief background. Bell Hooks first outlines her concept of engaged pedagogy in her book, Teaching to Transgress. This begins with her recalling of her own educational experience, learning from Black women who taught her that learning was revolution, and how that experience changed following school integration when she was a young girl. So, as Hooks puts it, quote, knowledge was suddenly about information only. It had no relation to how one lived, behaved. It was no longer connected to anti-racist struggle, end quote. So she talks about how she learned that in that new environment that politeness and obedience, rather than a deep enthusiasm for learning, was what was expected of her. So really holding closely to this experience, Hooks was really committed when she became an educator to the idea that the classroom should be an exciting place, right? It should be pleasurable, it should be fun. And so drawing on feminist scholarship and the work of Paulo Freire, Hooks committed to the idea that to encourage and foster excitement in the classroom was to transgress, right? Um, Agendas needed to be flexible, right? They had to allow for spontaneous shifts in direction during the course of a class. Students had to be seen and valued for their peculiarity as individuals. And as Hooks's now famous quote reads, quote, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence, end quote. So this is really where we start to see like Hooks's framework around education as a practice of freedom. And so this was a teaching model that is attempting to move beyond the memorization of information and towards a collaborative environment that really is about fostering critical thinking and encouraging the intellectual and spiritual growth of both students and teachers.
So let's talk briefly about the research around bias-free grading, right? So a lot of the evidence we have today suggests that implicit bias can impact grading in the classroom. And I'll share briefly about some of the ways this could show up, right? So students with a migrant background are often perceived as not as smart, right? And are likely to be given lower grades for producing the same type of work that native-born students produce. Similarly, this bias can exist around gender. So female students are often, especially when they're in male-dominated disciplines, their work is often perceived as not as good, even when they are producing the exact same work as their colleagues. Similarly, students with ethnic sounding names are likely perceived as not as smart, right? And again, similar pattern, right, where they will produce the exact same work and receive lower grades than their counterparts with white sounding names. And there's also this issue of the halo effect, where students who perform well in other contexts, right? Maybe the professor had them in other classes, right? Or they performed well in a previous assignment, and that sort of perceived goodwill is translated to other assignments, right? So if they're good in this thing, they're automatically perceived to be good in another thing and are more likely to be given a better grade, even if their work is subpar in that area. And then a final example of this are for students with learning disabilities. They're also more likely to be perceived as not as smart, not as attentive, right? And given lower grades for the exact same work that students without these learning difficulties are producing. And so the question really becomes, how do we acknowledge and address as educators that these biases exist? And how do we try and avoid the impact that these implicit bias have on our grading practices? So that led us, so both the research around bias-free grading and our knowledge of engaged pedagogy led us to creating this student engaged bias-free grading FLC. And this FLC operated as a collective that sought to bridge practices of bias-free grading with the values and holistic teaching approaches of Bell Hook's engaged pedagogy. This collective was designed to enable members to explore the ideas of student engaged bias-free grading, where we were combining an opportunity for clear learning criteria, right? Thinking about the learning criteria that we have in our classrooms and centering a collective environment between students and educators. We also recognize and try to grapple with the ways that grading and assessment itself can reproduce inequality and hurt students' holistic growth throughout the class. And therefore, we were looking at alternative grading approaches that focus on student learning and flexibility, right? And the ways that this can foster or reduce bias and create a more engaging classroom environment that builds this mindset, this growth mindset in students, right? So some of the things we talked about, right, was confronting bias and the ways that social class, gender, race, etc., could impact the classroom. Thinking about our syllabus, right, making sure that we're creating syllabus that are humanizing to both ourselves and our students, etc. So let's talk about how we could apply these, right? And there are a few ways that we talked about applying student engaged bias-free grading practices in our classroom. One of which is having flexible deadlines wherever that is possible, and that's one of the things that I try to do in my classroom. Each assignment has a different deadline. So there are assignments where students, I have sort of a soft deadline where I ask students to submit it by that date. But also if something happens, right, life happens, there's an opportunity for students to submit that material at some other point throughout the semester. But then there are also assignments in my classroom where it is sort of a harder deadline. And I am always communicative and express to students why it is, right, that these hard deadlines exist, right? So if we're working on an assignment that has different parts, right, you need to complete part one before you complete part two, right? And so flexible deadline wherever that is possible and clear articulation of why there is not a lot of flexibility in other deadline. There's also the opportunity for resubmission, right? Thinking about learning as not fixed, right? It's the cultivation of this growth mindset that we've spoken about before. So allowing opportunities for students to resubmit assignment wherever that is possible. Centering reviewing, right? So in a previous class, I would allow students, and this was a smaller class, I would allow students to submit a paper up to 4 times for review before submitting the final product. And this really allowed students an opportunity to grow, right? It is not going to be perfect the first time, and that's okay. And it also allows an opportunity for me to sort of work with students on a one-on-one basis in order to help them really improve their final product. I'm sure you can imagine, right, that this might not be possible in some situations. Again, this was a small class, and so I could allow students to submit that paper 4 times, but there are times where that is not possible. And throughout, I think Chloe will talk briefly about some of the benefits and challenges, right, of doing work like this. Another example is having clear rubrics, right? Making sure that we are clearly articulating to students what the expectations are. And again, we'll talk briefly about that or in detail about that later on. And then really prioritizing review, making sure that students understand that this is a collaborative environment, and part of recognizing the classroom as collaborative is making sure that you are accepting feedback from students on how they learn best, right? Even if it might be sort of a criticism of you, right? Like having an opportunity where they could be honest with you and talk to you about the ways that they think that their learning could be improved in the classroom.
Okay, so we've kind of outlined some of the principles or the approach of student engaged bias-free grading, and we're going to highlight just a couple of the benefits and challenges that we see and have experienced with this approach. This list is not exhaustive. This is sort of some of the big ones that we think are important to highlight. So on the benefit side, this approach can be really rewarding for both teachers and students, right? When there is sort of a co-creation of the classroom and the sort of mutual dialogue and learning becomes this dialogic process, it's really rewarding for students, but also for instructors, right? To feel like there's this level of engagement. Um, Again, also student having agency over the learning process, right, is really a strong benefit of this approach. Oftentimes students come into classrooms sort of expecting this banking style approach of teaching, right, where the instructor has the knowledge, they're going to distill that knowledge down and give it to the student, and the student is just a passive recipient, right? And when students are able to sort of flip and make that switch around having agency in the classroom and in the learning process, a lot of really great growth and excitement and fun happens in the classroom. And then again, as Rosheka, I think, kind of highlighted, this is a real opportunity to be more responsive to student needs in a very intentional way and in a very holistic way as a classroom. Um, this approach is not without its challenges, right? I think that maybe the most obvious being that this oftentimes requires more energetic attentiveness. So, teaching itself is already an energetically taxing experience, right, for instructors. And this is going to require, in many ways, more attentiveness, as well as just more sheer time doing things like grading, right? If you're going to review a student's paper 4 times, you're potentially quadrupling the amount of work that you're doing, right? There are some instances in which that kind of an approach works, and there are others where it's not feasible, right? And so figuring out where and when and how this approach can be applied is important. This approach can be difficult to implement if students don't buy into the idea, right? Or if there's division where some students in the class are sort of bought in and appreciative, and the others sort of are, for a variety of reasons, unable to meet you in that level of engagement, given what's going on in their lives or kind of where they're at in their educational journey. So, that kind of an approach is always a challenge that we sort of recognize in using student engaged bias-free grading particularly. And then finally, I just note like it can be difficult to like what I refer to as build the container, particularly in a virtual classroom. So, oftentimes for this kind of dialogic and relationship-based classroom environment to work, there has to be a lot of trust, right? And there's a lot of relationship building that has to happen early on, really in the first couple of classes of a semester, really kind of set the tone for this kind of thing, and are really critical for the instructor to sort of build this container for the classroom experience throughout the semester. This can be increasingly challenging in our experience in a virtual classroom. Um, the good thing is, in light of COVID, we learned a lot about how to build community in virtual spaces. And so it's not to say that this isn't possible, but particularly when, there is something about the relationality of it that when you're in person, being able to dialogue with students in real time, that this kind of trust building process can be a little bit more easily facilitated.
All right, so let's talk about another example. We'll go a little bit more into detail on peer review, right? That's one of the practices we talked about within the context of this the combining of engaged pedagogy and bias-free. So I see peer review as an essential anti-authoritarian classroom practice, right? It really values the knowledge that students bring to the classroom, right? We often think about knowledge as vertical, where I am the instructor and I have the knowledge and I sort of pass it down to students. And in fact, I think the way we should think about learning and um, the most, in my view, the most helpful way to think about learning is co-collaborated, right? We collaborate together in the classroom to build knowledge. And peer review really highlights the fact and the belief that students come into the classroom with their own wealth of knowledge that they can share amongst each other. So, in my race, crime, and justice class last semester, I incorporated a peer review component into the classroom. And it is beneficial to both students and also the educator for a variety of reasons. Number one, the teacher, it reduces the overwhelm that we talked about, right? That is a really big concern when we consider doing engaged pedagogy and bias-free. So it sort of offloads a little bit more of the peer review work, right? Where I am not the only one providing feedback, but I am relying on students to provide feedback for each other as well. And that sort of cuts the load that I have to take on. For the reviewer, it provides them an opportunity to see an alternative strategy, right, of how they could have done this assignment, sort of learn from their peers by reviewing other people's work. And it also gets them to exercise how to provide substantive feedback in a kind, helpful way, right? How to help other people improve their work. And for the student that is undergoing the review, they're receiving feedback, right, which is really helpful overall, but they're also learning how to pitch themselves to a wider audience, not just to you as the instructor, but to other students as well, right, and sort of build their muscle and like sending their work out there to be open to critique by others. One of the big challenge that I noticed while doing peer review last semester is that it's not an intuitive process. And so I had to spend a whole lot of time sort of explaining to students how this works, what's the relevance of doing this, right? There were students who were concerned about their colleague knowing who they are, right? And some sort of discomfort around that. And if that is of particular interest to you, right, and you are also really concerned about that, there is an opportunity to do this anonymously, right? But sort of talking to students about this, sort of helping them understand the peer review process is something that took quite a bit of time. And there, on the side of the reviewer, there were also concerns about whether or not they had the skill and had the knowledge to be sharing with other people, right? And so again, that took a lot of encouraging for me, right? And expressing to them my full confidence in their ability, right, and the knowledge that they have that they can share with each other, and being as encouraging as possible around that in order to sort of help them to build that confidence they need to provide feedback to other people.
Awesome. Thanks, Roshika. I can recall doing my first peer review assignment in my undergraduate experience and it being like a revolutionary thing. So, firm believer in peer review work. Anyway, so Roshiko's kind of highlighted peer review as sort of a specific approach to practice these principles that we've outlined. And I'm going to talk specifically about rubrics and the main high level point here, right, is that rubrics are not neutral, right? They can reinforce hidden expectations that we hold as instructors. They can reproduce bias through vague criteria, and they can prioritize this sort of compliance over learning. Or, if designed differently and intentionally, they can increase transparency between ourselves and our expectations with students. They can clarify expectations. They can reduce implicit bias by doing this, and then they can foster student agency in the process, right? So, drawing from bell hooks and the principles of engaged pedagogy, assessment itself should be relational, dialogic, and participatory, not just purely evaluative, right? And bias-free grading research shows us that ambiguity and norm-based comparisons are going to disproportionately harm first-generation, minoritized, and neurodivergent students. So again, rubrics reduce bias when they define criteria clearly, they separate components of evaluation for students, and they avoid vague traits like polished or sophisticated writing. Um, but again, this is not foolproof. Rubrics can also become compliance tools if they overemphasize things like formatting, right, which is usually not the goal of our educational endeavors. They can reward cultural capital and students' access to cultural capital and knowledge about how to produce the kind of thing that an instructor wants to see. And then they can penalize stylistic differences between students. But the important component is that rubrics are not just grading tools, they are actual curricular documents that communicate what we value to students. So, in the interest of talking about sort of applied and specific examples, I have highlighted sort of three examples here that I will quickly go over, and then I'll show kind of an example of each of these approaches on the next couple of slides. There are many different kinds of rubrics and approaches for evaluation. I have selected sort of three as examples here. So, points-based or analytic rubrics, right? These are rubrics that have very clear performance levels and they break skills into different components that contain sort of a certain amount of points. They can run the risk of overly fragmenting learning. One engagement approach or an engagement move to make these a little bit more engaged with students is to let students actually weight the categories. So you can work with students themselves in dialogue to be able to create these different weighted categories. Um, can you click the slide, Rosheka? Thanks. And then single point rubrics, the sort of second approach here. Uh, I think the value in single point rubrics is that they're very focused on sort of just did this work meet expectations based on how we've defined the expectations. And then it also leaves room then for narrative feedback about areas for growth or opportunities to improve, as well as documenting students' instances where they're exceeding expectations. And this, so again, this is really there's a really growth emphasis in single point rubrics. And an engagement move with these, right, is to have students self-assess first. So students take the single point rubric and assess their own work, and then submit that along with their assignment submission to then be reviewed by the instructor, right? Um, this gives a kind of an opportunity for, again, dialogue between the instructor and the teacher around assessment. And then the third approach that I will talk about is specifications grading or specs grading. This is really powerful to reduce hidden bias, right? Because there are clear yes or no meet standards approaches in specs grading. And it's really about centering mastery rather than point accumulation, right? It's about competence over like this ranking of how many points did you get relative to others' work on this assignment. And then it finally just it normalizes revision, right? We know that learning is iterative, it's not one shot, and this really kind of centers that approach. Again, an engagement move here with students is to co-create one or two of the specs with them, right? Get their feedback, what is unclear, so that they can sort of be a part of the process of creating the assessment in a meaningful way. So again, I think bias-free grading is not um, it's not only about reducing bias, right? It's about redistributing power in the evaluative process. So when students help to define the criteria or choose how they are evaluated, grading itself becomes a site of engagement rather than just compliance, right? Or writing to the rubric. Um, and I think so. For the first example, this is sort of a snippet of an example of a points-based rubric for research-based policy brief. So we can see, again, analytic rubrics are really good for increasing transparency, but transparency alone does not always equal equity. So how we define the criteria itself is where bias lives. So you can see here that the sort of rubric is broken down into components or different criteria, right? The argument, the evidence use, the organization, et cetera. And then there are sort of different points-based categories for excellent work, good work, developing, or needing revision. Um, so the transparency, right, itself is about reducing bias, right? This breaking evaluation into components that are clearly defined helps to reduce on this like gut feeling grading that can sometimes happen on instructors' part. It also separating the argument, evidence, and organization can prevent the halo effect, right? Rosheka talked about this a little bit earlier in the bias-free grading literature. But what this might look like is a student who has really strong writing skills, that may sort of mask weaker reasoning or argumentation. And we as instructors may be inclined to grade them sort of higher because of their strong writing ability. Points-based rubrics can help us to sort of like push back on that inclination. Precision in language really matters here. Replacing vague traits like sophisticated with observable criteria. So I've kind of noted this call out here as um, one very kind of concrete example of a way that, just saying something like, an excellent argument is sort of sophisticated, right? Which is very vague and potentially culturally coded, right? And transitioning that to something like claim is specific, it's arguable and supported with cited evidence. Right. This gives students a much clearer picture of what is expected, and it removes some of the opportunity for bias to creep into our approaches. Again, another kind of engagement approach here, we can allow students to be a part of the weighting process, right? Like how much should the argument be worth? 40% or 30% of the grade? How much about, how much should evidence use be weighted, right? This not only is this about giving them agency in this process and sort of a stake in the learning, but it's also inviting metacognition, which is an important component of learning, right? It asks students to ask themselves, what do I believe actually demonstrates learning most strongly, right? And that can be an important component for not only buy-in, but for the learning process itself. So again, it shifts grading from something that's just done to students and into something that's negotiated with them, something in dialogue with them. No rubric is perfect. Single point rubrics have some challenges. So a couple of risks to note. Sometimes the like over fragmentation of criteria can actually reduce more complex thinking into sort of checkboxes, right? And this can encourage students sometimes to sort of what we refer to as like write to the rubric rather than to think expansively and creatively about sort of constructing a paper. So one thing to kind of note with the overly granular nature of points-based rubrics sometimes. So the second approach that I'll highlight is single point rubrics. So again, with single point rubrics, we're able to kind of move grading from this ranking system that we see in the points-based approach to something that's really more dialogic, right? So you'll see here there's a category again for criteria, and then there's a column for meeting expectations that just gives an indication of what it takes to meet the expectations for argument, for evidence, for audience awareness, et cetera. And then there's blank boxes, right, for qualitative sort of feedback around areas for growth, as well as examples or, commenting on instances in which a student's work exceeds expectations in a certain criteria. So again, this is about centering this idea of meeting expectations, and it's focusing on proficiency rather than sort of ranking and comparing. And so this implicitly removes the hierarchy language that's baked in oftentimes to like a points-based approach. And I think the other real strength here, like the narrative space really matters, right? Leaving room for qualitative feedback while acknowledging that a student either met or didn't meet expectations is really where a lot of growth happens. Feedback becomes then sort of a coaching rather than just a justification of a score, right? It becomes an opportunity for dialogue, especially if students do the assessment first. So again, kind of an engagement move here is to have students first self-evaluate to allow assessment to become this conversation rather than sort of an evaluation and a justification for that evaluation on the part of the instructor. This encourages reflection, it encourages self-regulation for students in the grading process, and it helps to really disrupt the deficit framing that can oftentimes be associated with grading and assessment for students. And then in terms of bias awareness, right, because this is avoiding stacked performance levels, it's reducing the subtle comparative judgment that oftentimes happens implicitly when you read and grade a bunch of papers back to back to back. And it again encourages individualized feedback, right, in these kind of boxes, rather than just norms-based comparisons to some sort of idealized standard. Risks to note or challenges, right? This requires really strong instructor feedback practices, right? This single point rubrics work when there is detailed qualitative feedback, which is, in many ways more demanding for instructors. And sometimes single point rubrics, I think particularly because they vary so widely from what students are used to with a rubric, they can feel sometimes less concrete to students that are accustomed to a more points-based system. So these can take a little bit more time introducing students to and getting sort of buy-in around the value of this approach. So the final example that I will highlight is specifications grading or specs grading, what we think of as like mastery-based assessment. So again, in this kind of an approach, there is sort of to earn a pass, right? The brief, this is again with the research brief example, you will outline criteria like the brief has to make a clear, arguable policy claim. It has to use at least 5 credible sources. It has to accurately summarize opposing perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and the value here really is that specs grading is removing the illusion of precision in points and replacing it with clarity about learning. This work is often associated with the work of Linda B. Nilsson, and students in this kind of framework they either meet the clearly defined specifications or they revise their work until they do so. So if a student doesn't meet these expectations or these specifications, then they revise and resubmit their work until they get there. So this is I think also really a powerful approach that removes the sort of gradations of like an 87 versus an 89, which is again oftentimes ends up being reflective of subjective judgment rather than meaningful learning differences when we evaluate students. So it's about shifting grading from this question of like how many points did you lose for this versus to an approach that is more about have you demonstrated competency in the skill. Um, why is this effective for student engaged bias-free grading in particular? Again, the sort of partial credit systems often reward stylistic fluency or things like confidence, cultural familiarity with like academic norms and expectations. Specs grading asks a clearer question. Has the student demonstrated the skill? Yes or no? It also reduces this halo effect, right? And the greater mood effects that because evaluation is then anchored in predefined criteria. So it can be an effective way to challenge things like the halo effect, which Rosheka talked about earlier. Um, this also can be paired with blind grading, and it can sort of further reduce implicit bias. I mean, it's about treating learning as developmental and treating revision as part of the process of learning, not as a punishment. Students are then positioned as capable of growth rather than being judged on their first performance on an assignment. And this makes the standards visible rather than hidden. So, an engagement move here with specs grading is that you can actually introduce sort of a draft of specifications and then have a conversation with students and get their feedback. What would make this feel clearer? What about this feels ambiguous? What does clear argument actually mean, right? As instructors, even the times in which we think we're being very transparent, like clear argument, may not translate to a lot of transparency for students. So engaging in that conversation and ensuring that students really know what's expected of them can be a really powerful opportunity. And if students are then helping to refine the language of these specs, not only do they internalize the expectations and sort of inherently do better when they know what's expected, but they experience those standards as shared rather than something imposed from the top down. So this is about increasing buy-in and reducing, sometimes even reducing adversarial grade negotiations after an assignment.
So we wrapped up our FLC and want to wrap up this chat today by talking about what it is like teaching in this moment, specifically referring to the advancements in generative AI and this socio-political crisis that in which we live. And for generative AI, the issue is sort of how to uphold academic rigor within uh, this current reality, right? And we don't have any of the answers, but some of the things that we thought about and also will encourage you all to think about is how we stay informed about what AI is doing, right? If our students are 2 steps ahead of us, right, and know more about AI than we do, we are sort of doomed to fail, essentially. We also have to think differently about what it is like to measure growth, right? And how do we need to change the ways that we measure growth? Because the reality is that our students can just plug in our writing, uh, the writing prompt into some AI platform and get a pretty okay paper, right? So we also have to sort of rethink the ways that we are measuring success and growth in the classroom. It's also really important for us to continue to have discussions about AI in the classroom, including conversations with our students about what it means to use AI as a tool versus offloading all of your learning responsibilities on AI, right? Recognizing that in doing so, you are very likely training AI to replace you in the workplace. There's also the issue of socio-political crises, right? In which we are existing. And the reality is that whatever is taking place outside of the classroom does affect you as the instructor and your students, right? And so it becomes more challenging for you and for your students to sort of sustain yourselves and live well in a world that is often encouraging feelings of panic and fear. And it's really important here to recognize that um, the tactic of neutrality as an educator is not a tactic. In fact, it is well, it's a tactic, but it's a marginalizing one. And so it is really important that we understand the ways that education is political, right? Both what we teach and how we teach in this moment is shaped by cultural, social, and the political hierarchies in which we find ourselves. So again, no questions for you, but just things that it's really important for us to highlight and sort of continue to think about all of these things, teaching in this moment within the context of the things that we just highlighted with engaged pedagogy and bias-free.
So, in conclusion, Rashika and I think about student engaged bias-free grading as an adaptive approach that is explicitly trying to bridge bell Hooks's engaged pedagogy with contemporary bias-free grading practices. And doing this by combining transparent, clearly defined learning criteria with meaningful student participation and engagement in the evaluation process in order to reduce bias and redistribute grading power. In practice, this approach, right, is about making expectations visible and observable. It's about centering mastery and development over point accumulation and regurgitation and memorization. It's about reducing ambiguity, which is where implicit bias is able to oftentimes slip in. And it's about inviting students to co-construct, to interpret, and to reflect on criteria that's being used to evaluate their learning. This positions grading as a shared learning process rather than a unilateral judgment on the part of the instructor. So this is grounded in engaged pedagogy. It treats assessment as relational, as dialogic, as growth oriented, rather than purely evaluative. Drawing on bias-free grading research, right? That's about minimizing subjective, norms-based, or culturally coded justifications of judgment through explicit standards, through structured feedback for students, and through opportunities for multiple revisions of their work. So, student engaged bias free grading is the intentional design of assessment systems that reduce bias while enacting Hooks's engaged pedagogy by positioning students as really active partners in defining, sort of demonstrating, reflecting on, and learning learning from their own classroom experiences. So we've sort of shared the specifics of two kind of applied examples today, peer review, and then sort of approaches to structuring rubrics. But there are really many, many ways to apply these ideas in the classroom. So we just thank you all for your time, and we hope that this was helpful.
Here are references, and again, thank you so much.